So hi there. I'm Ann Mason, and I'm a member of the program committee for the National Railway Historic Society's Washington, D.C. chapter. Tonight, I'm moderating this session, and I'm assisted by Garen Goldsmith and Jim Perry. Our chapter's mission is to expand public appreciation of railroads and their appreciation through our preservation and education activities. And we do this through a variety of programs, including operating 3 rail cars, including the 2 in-cars in our beloved 1923 Pullman car, the Dover Harbor, who will be celebrating her 100th birthday next year. We maintain a railroad library at Bowie Tower in Maryland, and we publish our monthly newsletter, The Timetable. Another way we fulfill this mission is by offering free public programs, usually on the 3rd Friday of every month, including tonight's event. So tonight we welcome Charlie Ray. He is with the Historic Graffiti Society and will take us on a nostalgic walk exploring the history of hobos and their markings. Charlie and his father, Mike, started exploring ghost towns in the state of Washington in 2009. At first, this was a bonding experience between father and son. But soon, their yearly, week-long trips progressed as they became captivated by the vanishing fingerprints of miners in ghost towns. Especially captivating was the graffiti the miners left on the walls, buildings, and other structures. In 2013, they took an interest in hobo graffiti along the Milwaukee Road. Their mutual curiosity of exploring, documenting, and telling the stories of these places and people launched the Historic Graffiti Society in 2018. Since its founding, the Historic Graffiti Society works to tell the stories of individuals who found a way to document their presence as they passed silently through the landscape. So take a breath, everyone, and join us for what will be a fascinating talk about some railroad history that has remained and often remains just a scratched mark on a structure. We welcome you, Charlie, and over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Anne, for the great introduction. Huge thank you to the DCNRHS for organizing and hosting this event. There's always a lot that goes into these things, so we really appreciate the platform to share some of our work. And obviously, thanks to everybody tuning in right now, spending part of your precious Friday evening with us. As Anne mentioned, I'm Charlie Ray of the Historic Graffiti Society. It's a society, but there's only 2 of us, my father and I, and we are actually an official nonprofit, 501c3 based in Washington State. Our presentation tonight is Hobo Signs, the Trick of the Tramp. So I'll be covering a little bit of hobo history, giving you some context and background to the graffiti we'll be looking at. We'll cover monikers, which were the assumed names that tramps and hobos took while riding the rails. We'll look at the life of A Number 1, who was one of the first famous tramps in America, a very eccentric guy. And then we'll dive into hobo signs, kind of why we're here, looking at whether they may or may not have been this, widespread, widely understood secret language that hobos used. We'll end with Tex King of Tramps, sort of the next generation of hobo after A Number 1, who left tons of graffiti all across America throughout a life of riding the rails. We'll end with a brief video, and then, as Anne mentioned, take any questions you have at the end, but please use that chat function to queue those up in the meantime. One brief note before we jump in. You'll see newspaper illustrations throughout this presentation, and especially in the video at the end, you'll see sort of the lighter side of hoboing is presented by Hollywood and films, both of which, like I say, tend towards the lighter, the happier, romanticized view of hoboing. Because tonight's presentation is more focused on hobo signs, I'll be reviewing a lot less of hobo history, the hobo lifestyle, and the reality of things. But I don't want that to come across as we're romanticizing or sort of glossing over the reality of what was obviously an extremely difficult life and kind of traumatic for millions of people over the decades. So with that, we can jump into some hobo history here. So unhoused people have been on the move and traveling, long since before we had the hobos riding the rails or any laws against it, really since the beginning of humanity. And one of the first anti-vagrancy laws that was put into place was actually by Edward III. This was over in England in the wake of the plague or the Black Death, which had really decimated their workforce. And this law was to penalize idleness, keep people from kind of wandering town to town, looking for places that hadn't been as hard hit. So to penalize that, keep them stationary, keep them working, and kind of get their economy and everything back on track. Now, fast forwarding to the later half of the 1800s, we have sort of the newly built American Railroad growing exponentially, spiderwebbing its way across the country. And this is really what gives rise to the American hobo, obviously, who rides the rails, and allowed people who had always been unhoused and always been wandering to reach these small towns all across America that they really hadn't been able to easily get to before. And when the American Civil War began in 1861, the railroad became incredibly helpful for troop movement or, bringing away the wounded from the front lines, as you can see in this illustration here. And the war was the first exposure that many people had to riding the rails. The railroad was still pretty new, something that might have been expensive or not in your town. And after the war was over, many of these men actually returned home by hopping rides on freights and stealing rides there. As you can get a sense of how comfortable these guys are, kind of clambering all over the boxcars here in this 1864 photograph. Now, over the years, there have been many reasons why people ended up on the road, but it's always been really closely tied to the state of our economy. So, through numerous economic downturns, there's less employment, less resources. There's more people out on the road as a result of that. Over the years as well, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, mechanization started replacing a lot of jobs, in coal, iron, printing, shoe factories, glass, things like that, which led to more people being unemployed. Beyond that, in the economy, many people were driven to the road by poor home life, either the breaking up or divorce of a family or abuse at home, causing people to go out on their own and look for, something better down the line. And in 1900, it's estimated that there were already over 1 million people riding the rails illegally. Even just through Chicago, there were 500,000 people recorded passing through town alone in that year. Then when you fast forward to the Great Depression, things really hit their height. You have 25% of the population out of work, which is roughly 34 million people. So it's pretty easy to guess that there would have been multiple millions of people riding the rails throughout the Great Depression. Now, as far as the word hobo itself, we really don't know where it comes from or how it originated. It's still very murky. Even those people who had access to that first group of Civil War hobos who could ask them firsthand, get their take on it, just couldn't get a straight answer. There are a few theories that have been put forth over the years. Here are a few of them. So it might be a shortening of the Latin phrase homo bonus, meaning good man. It might be Civil War soldiers who were homeward bound, kind of returning home after the war. But the most likely and commonly accepted explanation is that it's an evolution of the term hoboy, which was an 18th century term for a migratory agricultural worker, which will make a lot of sense in a second when we kind of define what a hobo is, just on this next slide here. So as far as hobos, tramps, and bums, these days, many of us might think of these as being the same, but especially back during the Depression or even in the 20s before, these were very distinct sort of classes out on the road. And on the right here, you'll see Dr. Reitman's classification. This comes from Ben Reitman, who is an American anarchist and physician, and he traveled and studied hobos during the early 1900s, and he provides these distinctions between the three. So the hobo works as he wanders, trying to earn his way on the road. He's going to knock on your door and maybe split some firewood for you in exchange for a meal. You have the tramp who dreams and wanders. He's looking for a free handout on his way, not looking to work any more than he ever has to. Then lastly, the bum who drinks and wanders, or maybe more often than not drinks and doesn't end up getting around to wandering or ever leaving his hometown. And these class or group distinctions were taken very seriously back in the day when they were, in more heavy rotation, and they could cause a lot of offense if they were misused. Now, beyond hobos, tramps, and bums that we obviously think of as being in the sort of the freight riding and ride stealing world back in the day, we had other small groups of people as well. So we have yegs, and yegs were criminal tramps, but they were more organized crime type of folks. So they would have more specialized sets of skills, cracking, blowing safes. As you can see, this gentleman on the far left, sort of taking a breather after blowing open a safe there that's still smoldering, or maybe more organized home invasion, burglary kind of criminals. Next, you have jack rollers, who are also criminal tramps, but they would have been more of the opportunistic type. They tended to prey more on their own kind of robbing and stealing from other hobos who were out on the rails. And they really tended to follow the harvest seasons. So let's just say I just finished picking apples in Washington. I'm hopping a freight down to California to wait out the winter, and then maybe go back out on the road in the spring. And I've got all my seasonal earnings tucked away, maybe sewn into a hidden spot in my shirt, tucked in a money belt, part of it's in my shoe, inside my hat. And I get into a boxcar and I make a nice friend or a couple friends on there, and things are going well. We're having great conversation. The train gets rolling, gets up to speed, and all of a sudden they turn on me, pull out a knife or a gun even, force me to give up all my money, and then make me jump off the train while it's moving so that they can make a getaway with everything. Next, we've got jockers, and jockers would have been older, more experienced tramps who would try to pair up or team up with a younger tramp, and they would often try and convince young boys to join them on the road and become tramps. And these younger boys would have been their partners, referred to as road kids or punks, many other names as well. And unfortunately, these relationships were often abusive or even sexually abusive, unfortunately. But these partnerships did serve both parties sometimes. So the older tramp would have provided knowledge, sort of showing the younger tramp how to make it out on the rails, showing them the ropes, how to beg, and also providing safety from the other, men who might be preying on them while out on the road. And in turn, the younger hobo or tramp would be doing the begging. And you can imagine that sort of a young child would have a lot more luck knocking on back doors and getting the pity of the woman or the man of the house, who might even have their own child who had left home, who was out on the road, than maybe their the grizzled older tramp would have had, where they might have looked at them and slammed the door in his face and said, why don't you get a job or something like that. And we were all familiar with the song, The Big Rock Candy Mountain. This song is actually sung from the perspective of a jocker. He's singing about the cigarette trees and the soda water fountains and all these sort of fantastical things. And he's promising these to the young boy if he joins him on the road. You're going to see all these incredible sights and get to experience these things. And the lyrics as we know them today from that song are not the originals. It's reported that the original lyrics were probably much too filthy to ever have been recorded or put down into print. I'm sure it was one of those kind of hobo songs that was sung around the jungle fire at times, where everybody added their own verse and it just kind of evolved like a lot of our sort of American folk songs did. Next, we have gay cats, and a gay cat is just another slang term for one of those inexperienced tramps, generally a younger tramp or younger boy that the jocker would have preyed upon and convinced to partner up with him as his road kid or punk. And during the Great Depression, it really wasn't uncommon for young people to take to the road by the age of 12 or 14. So you can really understand how impressionable and vulnerable these young people would have been, especially at that age, being more trusting of an adult in the form of a jocker in this case. Now, lastly, I have women here, and they're separated out not because they were other or not a part of the rest of these groups. There were absolutely women tramps, hobos, bums, yegs, so on and so forth, but just separated out so that they get a special mention here, because many people don't associate them or even think of them as having been really a part of this history. And it's unknown how many women there were riding the rails. They really had to keep a low profile. As you can see here, this is actually a photograph of Mildred Harmer from a 1933 article. And she's got her hair, cut short, and she's kind of dressed as a man. And most women on the road traveled kind of in a manly disguise so that they could be protected and fit in as a man and thus be protected from other men who might prey on them on the road, also protecting them from the law. The police and a lot of aid organizations really would try and save women from themselves or save them from the road and sort of force them into programs or into jail if they were caught out on the road. And we often think about the shame that many men would have felt being on the road, down and out, maybe feeling useless, not having a job, unemployed and all that, feeling kind of purposeless. And that shame really would have been magnified for women at the time who were forced onto the road. Some of them obviously liked it, but for those who, didn't necessarily want to be there, it would have been really magnified shame because at the time they really, really were not fitting what society expected of them. And it's pretty unfortunate because I really believe that has contributed to the lack of documentation of women hobos. We've got tons of autobiographical works from the perspective of men from the teens, 20s, and 30s, but there's virtually nothing from women. So their stories kind of never been told, which is really unfortunate. So let's talk about monikers for a minute here. And monikers are the basis for the graffiti that my father and I have been traveling for the last 8 years and documenting. And a moniker is sort of an assumed name or a nickname that hobos took on while on the rails, or maybe you were given a moniker by one of your fellow tramps or hobos. And a moniker was often a mark of being an experienced tramp. So if you and I met on the way in and out of the hobo jungle, you greeted me and I responded with, "Hey, I'm Charlie Ray," you would immediately know that I was a gay cat or one of those inexperienced tramps. I should respond with my moniker and say, "Hey, I'm Salt Lake Slim. Which way are you traveling?" That sort of a thing, so as to not give away that I'm inexperienced. And these monikers provided a degree of anonymity. So not only anonymity from the law, them not really getting your real name when you're arrested for stealing rides on trains, but also a little bit of a separation from any of that shame that you might feel from being on the road. So I don't feel ashamed as Charlie being on the road and feeling, maybe kind of down and out and maybe useless in the world. Like nobody wants me, nobody wants to employ me. I have no sort of guiding purpose or anything. But now I'm Salt Lake Slim, my moniker. I'm surrounded by others with monikers and I'm kind of making a name for myself and sort of with like-minded people and everything. And like I say, these monikers are the basis for the graffiti that we've been documenting. And in the lower left here, you'll see a great example. And the marks that men and women left as they traveled really followed a pretty consistent formula. So you'll see here the top line adorned with the arrows there. We have A number 1, that's his moniker or nickname. Below that, we have September 4th, 1907. That's the date that this mark is being made. And then the arrow with the W at the bottom means west. So A number 1 is traveling west, September 4th of 1907. And monikers generally were based off of one of 3 categories or more. So the 3 main categories were the place from which one hailed, a physical attribute, or a personality trait. So to look at a few examples of that, you'll see some photos on these next few slides that are examples of the hobo graffiti that we've been documenting. These are from our archives. So let's dive into monikers based on nations and places. Here you've got a carving from Den Irish and Frisk Danny traveling together in 1895. And this is short for Denver Irish and San Francisco Danny, or Frisco Danny as it was often known, obviously referencing the places that they come from or the cities that they called home. A few more examples here. You've got Chi Slim or Chicago Slim, penciled on a railroad depot, November of 1910. And the upper right is Montana Rags. The lower left, we've got the Colorado Kid traveling in 1946, and he's traveling EB for eastbound. Then lastly here, we have Ohio Dutch from 1922. And unfortunately, this mark has had the swastika crossed out in the last century. And I say unfortunately because at the time this mark was made in 22, the swastika really didn't mean what we think of it as meaning today. The Nazis were certainly using the symbol, but it really hadn't been sort of perverted and twisted into what it is today. We actually see swastikas quite often in marks from the 19-teens. A lot of times we'll see it with railroad telegrapher marks. And at the time, it was just kind of used as a good luck symbol. So that next main basis for monikers was physical attributes. So here's a beautiful carving from 1915 from Shy Whitey. This is short for Chicago Whitey, and Whitey would have referred to his pale complexion, his skin color. Some more examples. We've got New York Peg from 1917. Peg referencing either a permanently injured leg or maybe even a physical prosthetic leg, possibly even an old wooden kind of pirate leg like we think of being a peg leg. There still would have been a few of those floating around back in 1917, especially for those who weren't of enough means to afford maybe a real prosthetic. In the upper right, we've got 1924, The Lost Midget. That one's a little hard to read, but obviously somebody with a very short stature or maybe even a real little person. In the lower left, I'd love to know the colorful story behind the dung-faced kid, but our best guess is it could be somebody that has a great collection of freckles or maybe even a prominent birthmark on their face. Lastly, here's Mississippi Red, and he would have had a bright red shock of hair that you could have seen from a mile away. And this mark is pretty unique. It's kind of adorned or framed with that matchbook there, which is pretty cool. So that last main basis for monikers is personality traits. And here we have Hop Alley Pete. And Hop Alley refers to an area of town where you could purchase and use the drug opium. And when you smoke opium, you become hopped up. And so Pete here likely had a proud hop habit. Some more examples. We've got the Shy Kid, obviously had an introverted way about him, traveling south, potentially a little bit of a double meaning there. Perhaps he hailed from Chicago or Chi-Town, as we've seen from previous marks in the presentation. We've got the Nomad from 1934. Obviously, this describes many tramps and hobos always on the move. In the lower left, we have Bad Boy Curly from 1932, traveling west. Perhaps he just considered himself a kind of a bad guy, or maybe he was one of those yeggs, those criminal tramps who was blowing and cracking safes. Either way, he's kind of proved his point here with the little skull and crossbones above his mark. Then lastly here, Lone Hobo Dutch traveling south. Obviously, many of these marks combine multiple bases for monikers. So we've got Lone, he likes to travel solo, and then he's also referencing some of his ancestry here. Now, among the thousands who traveled the rails and left their marks, there are a few who stand out above the rest. And A number 1 was one of the first really widely known hobos that became famous in America and sort of made his way into the public consciousness. And despite what this newspaper says in the upper left here, that A number 1 is a nomad of Earth whose name no man knows, his name is Leon Ray Livingston. It's not a major secret at all. And he really gave hoboing his all. As he traveled, as evidenced here, he would visit newspapers and sort of sell his story and his really eccentric personality in order to get write-ups, maybe in exchange for a buck or two, and really get his name out there and extend his legacy. And I mentioned that really eccentric personality, so I want to give you a few examples of that before we jump into his life story. He claims, and you'll see it on the cover of his books in the next few slides, he claimed to have traveled over 500,000 miles riding the rails, only spending $7.61. I'm not quite sure how he calculated that. It could be when he wasn't able to beg enough food and he had to buy a few things, or maybe he had to buy off some brakemen to avoid getting kicked off in the middle of the desert or in the snow or something. Not quite sure how he's calculated that figure, but he certainly hammers it home on the covers of all of his books and all of his newspaper interviews. He was so confident because of his tramping, hoboing lifestyle that he would end up dying trapped in a train wreck or a train derailment that he claimed that he carried 3 cyanide capsules with him at all times, one of which would put him out of his misery in 20 seconds or less. And then just in case that wreck ever came to claim him, he had his moniker supposedly tattooed on his forearm so that they could identify his body. And then the last eccentricity I'll mention here is, and this one's actually really true, as he traveled, he would carve potatoes into human faces and then sell them on his way. So I would assume that you could pay him to do a portrait of you or maybe a portrait of somebody famous at the time in exchange for his carving. Now, over the years between 1910 and 1921, Livingston published 12 books, and these detail his career in life hopping freight trains. All of the stories in these books range from extremely exaggerated to outright fiction or lies. And I want to give you a few examples of that. But before we get there, with that grain of salt in mind, let me give you a brief overview of his youth and how he kind of became a hobo here. So Livingston was born in 1872 in San Francisco. And on his 11th birthday, he was kicked out of school for bad behavior. And on his way home, rather than facing the shame of being kicked out of school or maybe the punishment from his parents, he decided that he was just going to run away and take to the road. And while he was out traveling, he ended up hopping some freighters and freight trains and all that. And he met up with Frenchie, as you can see here on the right. And Frenchie was one of these jockers we mentioned earlier, one of these older tramps that partners up with a younger tramp to be his road kid. And Frenchie convinced A Number One, yes, to be his road kid and gave him the moniker A Number One, telling him to always live up to that name and be the very best that he could, even if it only meant being the best tramp that he could. And he told A Number One to always leave this mark wherever he went so that when they were separated, Frenchie could always pick up his trail and meet back up with him. And despite what I said earlier about jockers sometimes being abusive to their road kids, A Number One claims that Frenchie always treated him kindly and supposedly even encouraged him to pray every night. Now, back to A Number One's lack of credibility and eccentricities I mentioned. I want to dive into a few of his stories and give you some examples of that. So on the left here is a great illustration from one of his books. In this story, back in 1889, Livingston had gotten off a train in a town and kind of got stuck there for a little while. And he met up with 8 boys who I believe had just come from a carnival, who were able to see some tattooed freaks from a freak show at the time. And they really wanted tattoos. And so he volunteers and manages to tattoo his moniker on the backs of all of their hands. And apparently they're totally clueless as to what this tattoo means, but all 8 of them agree to get it. Fast forward 21 years later, A Number One ends up back in the same town and sits down for a meal and realizes that he's being served by one of these grown-up boys. And apparently the tattoo hasn't faded a single day. It looks as beautiful as it ever did, just like he had freshly done it 21 years earlier. And thankfully, the waiter doesn't recognize him. And through their conversation, A Number One finds out that 3 of those 8 boys have grown up to become the town sheriff, judge, and jailer, which obviously scares him. So he chokes down his food, leaves in a hurry, vowing never to return back to that town lest they recognize him. So obviously this story feels very over the top, very tall tale-ish, very far-fetched, but there is an extremely slight possibility that it's true. So I do want to dive a little deeper down this rabbit hole and get into some true lies that he was willing to publish here. So in one of his books, From Coast to Coast with Jack London, which details stories of him supposedly riding freight trains from coast to coast, obviously with Jack London, he mentions that they got off of a boxcar here in Salt Lake City, and they just happened by chance to knock on the door of Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, and he had them split some wood in exchange for food, and then Smith sent them on their way well-stocked for their travels with more food. The problem with this story is that Joseph Smith actually passed away in 1844. A Number One wasn't even born until 1872. So there's at least a 30-year overlap there where there's no way that this could have happened. This book itself, From Coast to Coast with Jack London, wasn't even published until after London's death, and it was published almost immediately after. And there's quite a bit of evidence that points to the fact that they may have never even ridden the rails together at all. Now, if we jump over to the right side of this slide, this is an excerpt from a letter that Jack London sent to A Number One. And in it, he's refusing to corroborate a lie that A Number One has been telling people. A Number One had been traveling and telling people that he had sort of heroically convinced London to give up his tramping, his hoboing ways, and return home to safety and live a better life for himself. And he wanted London to send him some sort of note or postcard or photograph that was signed in order to lend some credibility to this story. And this is just an excerpt of London saying, "I refuse to do this for you. I won't make a liar of myself, and you're making a mistake telling people this fairy tale." So all of this just to prove out a little bit before we get to the topic of Hobo Signs, that A number one wasn't above publishing complete lies or fiction. Now, one thing that A number one did not lie about, whether it was Frenchie he met up with that encouraged him to do this or not, one thing he didn't lie about was leaving his mark or being inspired to leave his mark everywhere as he traveled. And he ended up getting arrested quite often for it. You can see here, he inked or painted his mark outside of a federal building on the wall. One of these mentions him getting arrested for carving into some brand new, beautiful hardwood saloon doors that wasn't very welcome. So he definitely was arrested numerous times for putting his mark in unwanted places. Later on in life, in 1914, A number one settled down in Erie, Pennsylvania with his wife and raised a family. And then in the 1920s, he began traveling and giving talks. And the goal of these talks was to try and convince the American youth to avoid riding freight trains or getting sucked into the life of being a tramp or a hobo, sort of to avoid catching the wanderlust that had really gripped him for his whole life. And it's pretty interesting to go back and read not only A number one's writings, but other writings in newspapers at the time and see how they talk about the wanderlust. They really describe it as almost a drug or something that can get into your bloodstream, something very physical that can kind of change maybe your brain chemistry. And you might be able to escape the road or go home and live there peacefully for 6 months or a year. But, in the dead of night, one night, you're going to hear the road calling to you and you won't be able to stand it anymore and get sucked back into being a tramp or a hobo. And despite rumors that he had died decades earlier in a train wreck, A number one actually passed away at home of heart failure in 1944. So on to Hobo Signs here. A number one, throughout his books and newspaper visits, really sold the idea of Hobo Signs as this secret language that allowed hobos to communicate and receive information that others weren't privy to by reading these cryptic symbols. And the idea of Hobo Signs appears decades before A number one ever published his book that has this set of signs you see here on this slide in it. But he was really the first famous hobo to promote their existence. Once again, we've already discussed that A number one isn't the most credible necessarily. Just because he lied about other stories doesn't necessarily mean that he lied about Hobo Signs. But I want to make sure that we're at least very cautious of assuming that this famous hobo is lending any credibility just because of his fame or his having published books or anything like that. And if we take an objective view of Hobo Signs, they really do make a lot of sense on paper, right? If I'm brand new to a town, I've never been here before, I don't really have the lay of the land, I hop off a boxcar in town and I'm able to see a sign somewhere that tells me that this area is unsafe or the police patrol here, that would be really helpful information. Or it might save me a walk across town if I can see on a gate post that this house is really friendly, they'll probably welcome me in and feed me. That would be super handy. Now, over the years, over the past 150 years, Hobo Signs have been covered in newspapers too many times to even count. And they show up as early as the 1870s, and they're still published about even today, though less frequently. They've been published about so much so that we've really accepted them as more than just kind of American folklore. And most people just believe that they're a reality, something that was absolutely widespread and an authentic history, that hobos used these signs and that only they knew about them and how secretive they were and all that. And all of that, despite numerous newspaper articles throughout the last 150 years that said the opposite and would say that Hobo Signs weren't actually real as well. Sometimes a newspaper would publish, 1 decade about how they were real, then fake, and then real again, just kind of whatever sold the papers, I suppose, year to year. And looking at these sort of overly dramatic headlines, you can understand why they've really captivated us as Americans, right? You've got hobo kings and secret codes, strange underground languages, hieroglyphics, curious universal sign language, tramps and criminals, all these exciting things. And obviously, as humans, we love to be sort of in the inner circle and feel like we are privy to some knowledge that not everybody has and feel like we're kind of special and in the know, so to speak. But for us, there's been a lot of things in our research that make us very skeptical of hobo signs. And my father and I ultimately believe that hobo signs were never a widespread, commonly used system of communication and may never have been used in any measurable way over the years. So I want to dive into some sources and reasons that have led us to that conclusion. So the first major issue that we take with hobo signs is that over the years, there's been hundreds, maybe even 1,000 different sets of hobo signs published or put forth as being authentic sets, and they just don't really agree. So you've got everything from the most simple geometric shapes like a circle or a diamond to these two sets on the left side of the slide that are so overly complex that they would have been a hassle to learn. They never would have been convenient to spend the time chalking those up. They probably would have taken half a stick of chalk to do in some cases, and just wouldn't have been very user-friendly. And even over the years, the most simple signs like the circle being drawn by the gentleman on the right side of this slide, none of the signs agree upon what that means. Obviously, you can find some crossover, but there's a ton of conflicting meanings behind that sign, just depending on which set you're consulting. So a small sample of examples: the circle could mean religious, nothing doing or no use, good people reside here, bad people reside here who hate hobos and call the cops, or get out. Once again, just depending on which set of signs you're consulting. So not a ton of consistency in the look or feel of the signs themselves or their meanings. Now, another issue we found with hobo signs in our research is there's just a huge lack of very credible documentation or evidence beyond just the large mass of newspaper articles that have been published over the years. And so at the bottom of the slide, you see that some newspaper articles do have photographs that involve hobo signs. But if we look at the two that have actual people in them, these two men are mid-mark. Obviously, the one on the far right feels very staged. I don't know why he would be finishing the mark on that R rather than at the bottom or maybe at the top. He's, posing for the camera, looking straight into the lens. And then our gentleman on the left here in 1905, as far as I know, that would have had to have been staged as well, just simply based on the limitations of cameras at the time as well. To catch him in action and have had a camera set up and all that just wouldn't have really been feasible. Now, the other two on the far left here, we've got ones that are chalked. And the problem with these is that they tend to feel very fresh and staged for the newspaper article. It's hard to believe that somebody would have said, take an entire week to go hunt down 7 to 10 authentic, freshly done hobo signs, and that somebody actually got lucky enough as a journalist to go out and do that and spend the money to photograph them, develop, and go through the whole darkroom and printing procedure there. And while obviously they didn't have Photoshop at the time, images like this third one over on the shy 152 milepost there, they could have possibly been done post photograph in the darkroom somehow. They seem so dark and so fresh that it's possible that they were added after the photograph was taken of that milepost or of the brick wall or whatever the surface ends up being that's in the photograph. And in our own travels and documentation, we've photographed over 1,000 pieces of hobo graffiti that are the moniker style that we looked at a lot of examples of. But we've never come across an authentic hobo sign. And you might be looking at this photograph here in the upper left, which is one of ours, and be thinking, well, that looks like a hobo sign. And in the upper right, you've got it circled there. It's the sign that the jail in town is okay. It's sanitary. They'll probably welcome you in, let you stay out of the elements overnight in a cell if they have an empty cell, and they'll let you out in the morning, no problem. But unfortunately, this just isn't an authentic sign. And we know that because this is actually done by a railroad employee, most likely. And it's inside of a railroad depot in the freight room. And it's done on the wall with shipping crate ink that would have been available in the freight room for sort of marking and addressing packages. And it's also surrounded by hundreds of other marks, doodles, names, and everything, which we can trace back to being railroad employees at that depot. So we have a lot of telegraphers and other employees surrounding this. It's most certainly still cool and unique. It's one of the few references we've ever found. It's definitely from the 1910s or 20s, when A number one was publishing his books, and Hobo Signs would definitely have been sort of in the public interest and public consciousness. But unfortunately, it's just done in a place that hobos in the public wouldn't have been welcome, especially not to be marking on the walls, and once again, surrounded by tons of other employee marks. Now, beyond this type of documentation and evidence, there's many people out there that have a family member that sort of have a story or an oral history that's been passed down about Hobo Signs. And we've heard hundreds of these throughout our travels and over the years. But the problem with these stories is they tend to follow a very consistent narrative, and they tend to be very vague. And so the story tends to be my grandfather or my grandmother said that there must have been a hobo sign on their house because the hobos always stopped in. They seemed like they were always showing up for food, and they just seemed like they always knew how to find, our friendly house for them. When in reality, the most likely answer is that they happen to live either near a railroad yard, near a hobo jungle, or along a common path that hobos would have taken, either between the two of those, or maybe on the way to a place where they could actually buy food or sit down for a meal, or even traveling from one side of town to another to get from, maybe one railroad line to another to get out of town going in another direction. Not that there was actually a hobo sign secretly chalked on their house that they were never able to find or see. So even more evidence here. Let's look at what some people who would have been there at the time, experienced the life of a hobo, and have some firsthand knowledge say. So first, let's talk about Josiah Flint. And he lived the life of a hobo for at least 8 months in the late 1800s, and later wrote out his stories and the stories of others for newspapers and magazines, even publishing his own books detailing his stories and sort of the hobo lifestyle as well. Then later on in life, he actually sort of turned against his old ways and was hired on as a railroad detective, which is pretty interesting. And he would travel around and dress as a hobo and tramp to fit in, and then sort of use that to his advantage to entrap and get hobos and tramps arrested. So from both of those sort of opposite lifestyles, you would think he would not only have some knowledge of hobo signs, but maybe would have even used them to entrap hobos or get into their good graces, knowing the secret signs, or maybe even going as far as putting up incorrect signs, that this is a safe space, or nice people live here. And then obviously a policeman answers the door and catches you, kind of a thing. But Flint writes this about hobo signs. Hobos do not make use of the marks and signs with which popular fancy has credited them. And then he later goes on in the same book to talk about monikers, which we obviously saw plenty of examples from our archives. Now, next we've got Nels Anderson, who was another early American sociologist. He studied at the University of Chicago after arriving by freight train, no less. And his first publication was The Hobo in 1923, which he wrote after living his life as a hobo throughout his youth, and then conducting more organized studies in 1921 and 22. And Anderson, while he's referencing or writing about another volume or another person's work, writes this about hobo signs. Another merit of the book is that the author has not subscribed to the fiction that American tramps have a sign language, as so many professors are wont to believe. So obviously two firsthand accounts here. They're speaking out, saying that hobos really never used these secret symbols or sign languages that many people believe in. Now, beyond these two quotes, we have a pretty extensive hobo library. You can actually kind of see it here over my shoulder. That's top to bottom, railroad, mostly hobo related books. I counted the other day, there's 60 plus autobiographical volumes. And throughout all 60 of those, there's only one fleeting reference to a hobo sign, this chalked mark on a house that was supposedly meaning that you could get a meal there. So definitely not a ton of validation from firsthand accounts. So there are a ton of other angles and things we could talk about with hobo signs to examine them from, but I'd like to end with just a quick reminder that hobos and tramps really made their way in the world by bending the truth and maybe outright lying. And A number one really isn't unique in that way. He's not a bad guy because he was telling these tall tales in his books. It was just kind of the way of life. And these tall tales were often referred to as ghost stories or gags. and you would use them to just make life easier for yourself. So if I'm crossing town, I get stopped by the police, they're wanting to run me in and lock me up for vagrancy, I'm going to spin them a yarn and say, you know what, I'm just crossing town to get to the railroad yard. I have my brother in Chicago. That's right where I'm going. First thing smoking out of the yard. He's got a guaranteed job for me. I'm not going to be a problem for you or in your hair by the morning. If you knocked on the back door and the woman of the house or man of the house came to the door and they let you in and were going to feed you, you would tell them that your brother or your friend was too sick or starving to come with you and beg that day, but they were just down the road, maybe sick and starving under the railroad bridge. And you did this in order to get a second or even third portion of food to take with you that would carry you through the rest of the day or even through into the next day. And these tall tales, once again, referred to ghost stories or gags, would often have been spun together and perfected over the years. You know, you'd spend hours around a jungle fire conversing, sharing stories, and you might spin these half-truths from, you know, maybe 100 other Tramp stories into your own that you could try out on the road and see what was successful. And then many hobos and tramps also use grifts or other swindling tricks sort of to up their success in begging. So they might fake illnesses, accidents, or deformities while begging to prey upon people's sympathies and up their success there. And so with all of this in mind, is it not possible, or maybe even more than likely, that hobo signs were just another one of these gags or ghost stories in order to make an easy buck from a newspaper reporter, or maybe get somebody interested, maybe a little more interested than they were originally, in feeding you in exchange for some of these stories? And as this newspaper article mentions, many a tramp, for example, is an expert storyteller. His tales of romance and adventure on the road far more than repay the stay-at-home householder and his wife for the kitchen lunch that buys the story. Perhaps not every fact that's recounted totals 100% truth. Why should it? So as you can see here, hobos were often expected, or maybe it was just common knowledge, that they almost provided an entertainment, right? So you would give them food, sit them down and talk to them, and they may almost feel obligated to tell you these tall tales and get you excited as payment for maybe the clothing you're handing down to them or the food that you're giving them. So previously in this talk, we looked at many of the examples of actual marks that hobos left in the form of monikers, but instead of secret signs, they really used word of mouth to communicate. So what towns should be avoided, what towns were more friendly to hobos, was all shared by word of mouth around the jungle fires at night or in passing even. Where are you headed? I'm going east to Austin, Texas. Oh, I wouldn't stop in Houston. It's really bad right now. You know, don't get off the train, just ride through if you can. All those sorts of stories were shared around the jungle fire or even in the hours spent riding freights together, which is still the case today. Word of mouth is how modern rail riders often share their words of advice or what the current status is as you're riding from coast to coast. So in summary, I've made it really clear that we don't put much stock or belief in hobo signs. While it's still possible that they were used infrequently, maybe by smaller numbers of people, we believe that it's pretty safe to say that they were not a widely known and used secret language of tramps and hobos, as is commonly thought to be the case. So leaving hobo signs behind, let's talk about one more famous tramp from America here. And we talked about A#1 giving those talks later on in life, right? Where he's trying to save the American youth from the wanderlust, keep them from being tramps and hobos. But one youth he definitely wasn't able to reach was Jesse Wells. And Jesse Wells might not be his real name. Throughout his interviews he gave to newspapers, he gave a combination of Jesse or James Wells, even sometimes Jesse James. But he's better known for his moniker Tex King of Tramps. And while he did seek notoriety amongst his fellow tramps and hobos, leaving his mark from coast to coast throughout a lifetime of riding freight trains, he really never did the newspaper circuit to try and sort of get famous in the public consciousness like A#1 did. Now, by his own admission, he was inspired to leave all of these marks by A#1. You know, Tex was sort of the next generation after Leon Ray Livingston, A number one. So he still would have been able to see A number one's marks, on railroad sheds and under bridges and things, the majority of which have been demolished and lost over the last century plus. And if it wasn't for him getting arrested for riding trains or getting caught leaving his mark, and then maybe getting caught while in jail by newspaper reporters and agreeing to do an interview, we would know almost nothing about Tex or his life beyond his marks. Now, once again, the same caveat applies. Tex really wouldn't have had any reason to tell the full truth to these newspaper reporters. So once again, take all this with a grain of salt. But through these newspaper articles, we learned that Tex was born on the Isthmus of Panama in 1901, and then he was orphaned by the age of 8 and took to riding the rails by 1915 when he was the age of 14. And he spent a lifetime riding the rails, at least through the 1960s and possibly into the early 1970s, likely with some breaks from the road here and there, whether it was through the winter or maybe taking a year or two off when he found maybe a good situation that was a little more stable or just needed a break. Obviously, once again, it was an extremely difficult life, especially to keep up day after day after day for decades. And we know all of this of how long he was on the rails just by the dates of all the marks that he left. Now, as far as those marks, Tex tended to leave 3 different types. So the first type is engraved, and these are all on the bathroom partitions, the marble or granite in the men's restroom, separating the stalls. And in the upper right here is kind of an interesting mark. He's marked here right above CNA Slim. That's the moniker for Chicago and Alton Slim, which is just the name of a railroad line. And Tex has adorned his mark with these arrows, quotes, and kind of these little slashes. And he uses them sort of as separators or delimiters. So you've got one between the X and the K, and then one that's kind of odd, right, between the T and the E on Tex. And this one is to denote that it's not just Tex, King of Tramps. It's actually Tex, Extraordinary King of Tramps. No humility there, right? There's not really any explanation why he added extraordinary into his name, but as far as we've ever been able to find, we've never found a mark that has extraordinary written out, just Tex KT or Tex King of Tramps. Now, the second main type of mark that Tex left was carved with jackknives into wood or other surfaces on railroad outbuildings or depots. And while there are some that are on exteriors, you can see the one in the lower right here is nicely weathered. He tended to prefer the interiors of railroad depots, and especially the inside of the men's restroom door, either on the door or the door frame. And these carvings, if you ever have a chance to see one in person, are incredibly impressive. They tend to be extremely deep, up to 1/4 or 1/2 inch deep in these absolutely rock hard wooden doors. And because of this, the time it would take to keep it clean and accomplish this in such a precarious position, being inside of a depot, making noise, maybe with people coming and going from the bathroom, these marks tend to be shorter. Usually they don't contain a date and direction of travel. They're just his moniker, Tex KT. And on to his third type of markings here. He did these with a brush and paint. This one's pretty rough. It's an earlier one from 1929. This is one of the earliest ones we've been able to document. This one looks pretty rough, like I say, and this one might have been done with either a really old brush that was maybe caked in dried paint, or possibly even just a rag with some ink or something like that. Once again, we see that classic moniker format. He's traveling west in 1929. Here's another similar mark on a railroad-facing warehouse that was served by the railroad, just to kind of give you more context, give you more scale for these marks. And obviously for this one, he was able to either steal a ladder, or maybe there was some product waiting to be shipped there on the loading dock that he was able to climb up on and get this mark up so high. Here's another example that shows you a kind of a good amount of scale. Some of these are really impressive, almost billboard-like, that somebody really could have had the time to read and see from a far distance when riding by on a freight train, and would have known that Tex had, spent some time under this bridge, maybe taking a break from freight trains, or maybe he'd gotten kicked off here and had to wait here for another ride. Here's that same mark up close. Once again, we've got the classic format. He's traveling west. We've got that extra interesting dash between the T and the E on Tex for Tex Extraordinary, King of Tramps. And then the upper right, we've got something new in the form of X-993055. We'll talk about those numbers a little bit more here in just a second. But the coolest thing to note here is that he's traveling west in July of 1940. And here in this mark, almost exactly 1 month later, he's still traveling west, but now it's August and he's in a totally different state, which is a lot of fun for us because we're able to track a little bit better. He was here this month, how would he have gotten there, and be able to kind of piece together his life. And coming back to those interesting X numbers here, I may have robbed some of you of the mystery and excitement of Hobo Signs tonight, so I want to leave you with another mystery to chew on. Now, we have reason to believe that these X numbers are rail car numbers. So this would mean that he had stolen a ride to this area on boxcar or whatever railroad car, number 790106. I know we've got a lot of railroad buffs and historians here tonight. So if any of you have anything to add or can help us debunk this, we'd love to hear from you. If you want to email us, get in touch with social media, whatever works for you, we'd love to have your assistance or your thoughts on that there. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. It's kind of sad for me, but I do want to use it to talk about preservation for just a second. And every year we tend to retrace our steps a little bit in our travels, and we realize that marks that we were able to photograph intact a year or 2, 3 years ago are now demolished, defaced, destroyed or marred in some way. And throughout his interviews, Tex mentioned that he had kept really complete journals of his travels and that he potentially planned to publish these later in life. But unfortunately, we've never been able to find any credible evidence that these ever were published. So his marks are really all that we have to be able to know much about his life and where he was and how he traveled and all of that. So with that, I would just urge you, if you're somebody that's interested or takes interest from here on out of historic graffiti, you happen to find some, it can be really fun and exciting to want to add your own marks. But I'd really encourage you not to add your own marks nearby or anywhere near old graffiti. Tex is kind of the exception, sometimes leaving 10-foot wide marks. A lot of historic graffiti tends to be tiny pencil marks that are, smaller than the size of a dollar bill or even the size of a silver dollar. And new marks tend to draw more new marks as it kind of inspires other people or even gives them permission to add more marks to a surface. And eventually you end up with either somebody deciding that the whole surface needs to be cleaned or somebody careless ends up defacing the actual old historic mark. So just a note on preservation there, if you guys can help us keep an eye out for this stuff and give it some respect when you find it and just enjoy it as that part of history. Now, hobo marks for us in closing are this mostly undocumented evidence of a mass movement of people across America that's tied to so many major events in history like the Great Depression. And they're this physical representation or almost a voice of this really unique hobo culture with its monikers and nicknames. And it brings that voice to the millions who rode the rails who might not have ever published their stories or have ever, gotten their life out there and been able to share it. And while historic marks are lost, as we just saw every year, those that still remain along the railroad proclaim that Tex is still the king of tramps. So that's our presentation for tonight. I'm going to jump over from PowerPoint over to that brief 10 or 12-minute video. Then we'll come back and take some questions. I do have some zines or booklets available through our website if you're interested in reading more about hobo signs or women hobos. These zines contain a collection of newspaper articles, generally from the 1870s through the 1950s on those subjects. So if you're interested, feel free. Like I say, I'm going to come back to this slide, so don't worry too much about getting all of our contact information right now. But let's jump over to that video real quick.
My mentor on the rails was the great Roadmaster from Portland, Oregon, a prodigiously great tramp. And I do mean a tramp. Like Ben Reitman said in San Diego many years ago, a hobo works and wanders, a tramp dreams and wanders, a bum drinks and wanders. Tramps are the intelligentsia of the traveling nation, conscientious malingerers, you might say. Suits me fine.
Names don't convey so much as signs, and tramps have a sort of touch-and-go code which they use to tell each other whether it's better to go before trying to touch. This sign, for instance, means no good. Well, he's made his call, and in a moment or two he'll make out his report. Other gentlemen out for a stroll like him would be grateful for a tip-off. And here it is. The triangle means too many callers. Aha, here's a rival, but she doesn't know the code. That's religious, but good on the whole. Keep off, we'll have you pinched. And finally, dangerous. Don't touch it with a barge pole. That's how the Knights of the Road conduct their correspondence.
That every hobo has a moniker that rides the rails, because without a moniker, you never want to use it in your own name, you know. And different monikers fits different bows. Well, yeah, I was given the name Rotor Hog by some other bows along the tracks because I'd be riding the units. And some of the bows would be jungling down the tracks. They'd say, well, there's Rotor Hog getting off again. See? So I kind of got that handle that way. See, that's a moniker. Other people, Itchy Foot Stetson. He's got that moniker because he likes to wear a Stetson hat and he's got itchy feet. Frisco Jack, another famous moniker. Like some of these younger bulls down here, now some of them are tramps, and some of them are dinglings and mission stiffs and all that, but part of my job as being an older, experienced bow is I want to teach them about their self-reliance and their self-confidence, about when they get to a town, that there ain't no shame in walking up to someone's door and say, hey, can I do a little work for you? Can I clean your yard up? Can I wash your windows? You know, all that stuff. You know, that makes them a top hobo, because they got their self-confidence and they got their self-reliance.
Reitman Jack started tramping in 1927. I mean, he was old, and he was good at the trains. We were sitting around his fire, and Frying Pan Jack said, I learned when I was young that the only real life I have is the life of my brain. But if it's true the only real life I have is the life of my brain, what sense does it make to hand that brain to somebody for 8 hours a day for their particular use on the presumption that at the end of the day they will give it back in an unmutilated condition? Bad chance. So he said, I learned when I was young, if I cannot dictate the conditions of my labor, I will henceforth cease to work. Ha!
I spent my whole life making somebody rich. I busted my ass for that son of a...
Boy, it's looking at labor like that. It's made a hobo out of me. Can you imagine? On a day like this? Come on. Mr. Thorne, I'm a conscientious objector to manual labor in any form. Get over there, get over there. I yield only to superior force. Come on.
Oh, why don't you work like other folks do? How can I get a job when you're holding down two? Hallelujah, I'm above. Hallelujah, above again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. Oh, I went to a house and I knocked on the door. The lady said, Scrambum, you've been here before. Hallelujah, I'm above. Hallelujah, above again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. Yeah, I went to that house and I asked for some bread. The lady said, Scrambum, the baker is dead. Hallelujah, I'm above. Hallelujah, above again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. There I am in Spookaloo, city of magic, city of light, ensconced upon my front porch in broad daylight, long about noon, my rising time, drinking something of a potable beverage, playing my guitar. long after everybody else in the neighborhood has packed up their lunchbox and gone off down to Kaiser Aluminum to put in their shift. This enrages my neighbors. One in particular across the road, little retired banker fella, been known to cannonball his rotundity across the road and stand there and publicly berate me for my sloth and indolence. Why don't you get a job, he said. Some of you heard that, I'll bet. Now me being hit with the Socratic method fires back a question. Why? Why, he says, taken aback. If you had a job, you could make $3, $4, $5 an hour. I said, why? Pursuing the same tack. Said, hell, you make $3, $4, $5 an hour. You could have a savings account. Save up some of that money. I said, why? He said, well, you save up enough of that money, young fella. Pretty soon you never have to work another day in your life. I said, hell, that's what I'm doing right now. Oh, I like my boss, he's a good friend of mine. That's why I'm starving out on the bread line. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. Yeah, and I like Jim Hill, he's a good friend of mine. Say, that's why I'm booming down Jim Hill's main line. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. I guess pretty soon I'll be headed back to Spokane, take up my task of wintering in, and I do a little light farming or heavy gardening, whichever. You know, that kind of farming is hard if you're in this traveling profession, and of course when you sing like I do, you got to be ready to travel with considerable alacrity. I got a Greyhound bus ticket in my back pocket all the time. But you see, quite often I'm not back in town in time for my plowing or my planting. That's awful. But now one time I was sharing a platform in New York City it was with a bunch of high-powered labor politicos. It was a benefit for the farm workers, that's what it was. I remember Richard Chavez, Cesar's brother, was there. And so was Bella Abzug, former congresswoman from the state of New York. Remember her? Wonderful woman. I mean, she was loud, vociferous, big hats. She was yelling at that audience, righteous beef it was, about how the feds, the FBI, had been opening her mail for ever so long. Well, I knew the feds had been opening my mail for at least 20 years, reading all my personal radical mail, and it never bothered me because I figured them birds had to learn that stuff somewhere, and it might as well be from my mail. But then it occurred to me in my predicament, having the FBI open your mail might come in handy. I sent Sheila, my partner, a letter through the United States mail, and I said in it, "For God's sake, don't plow up the backyard. That's where the guns are buried." National Guard rolled up, dug up the whole backyard in time for me to come back and plant the damn thing. Oh, I went to a bar and I asked for a drink. He gave me a glass and he showed me the thing. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. Whenever I get all the money I earn, the boss will be broke and to work he must turn. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. And why don't you save all the money you earn? If I didn't eat, I'd have money to burn. Hallelujah, bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again.
All right. So huge thank you to everybody for tuning in. Like I say, for spending part of your Friday evening with us. Happy to take as many questions as there are. And thanks again to Ann and everybody organizing over at the DCNRHS and for giving us this time.
Hey, well, thanks very much, Charlie. We have a number of questions that have come in, so let's get to as many as we can. We're a little over time, so I hope that people will continue to stay. The last video, there was a bunch of tramps all climbing on and jumping off at the same time. Is that a fiction of the movie telling business, or is that something that actually happened?
It probably just depended on the year and time and place. I mean, I'm sure it happened at some times, during the height of the Great Depression. Realistically, it wouldn't have been ideal, obviously. If you could get on a train while it was stopped and it was safe, you would obviously do that and just relax until it got ready to take off. The main time that might have ever happened would have been more of, if here's the train yard, here's the throat and the opposite end, and the yard's really hot, the railroad bull, maybe Jeff Carr or one of these really sadistic and infamous railroad bulls who would actually shoot at hobos that you would catch riding the trains. It's his yard, so everybody stays out of the yard and has to try and catch it while it's moving on the way out. That might have been a case where you would have kind of a mad scramble to try and get on, but it definitely wouldn't have been anybody's first choice for methods of getting on or off. And it really wouldn't make a ton of sense for people jumping off at the same time either, just for safety. And obviously, you would obviously be getting off when it stopped at a town or something, unless you had no other choice.
When they were coming on to boxcars like that, was that more prevalent in that kind of quantity of people during Depression times?
Yeah, absolutely. That would have been the time. If you ever had a group that big, it definitely would have been during the Depression for sure. And I guess it might have been also a thing, you hear about even before the Great Depression about these tramp armies or Coxey's army, things like that, where tramps were really almost taking over trains and forcing them to stop where they wanted and things like that, kind of strong arming the railroad operators and engineers into doing things for them. So that might have been another case for sort of a big group swarming over a train, but definitely not the everyday norm, I would imagine.
Well, with all of these tramps and all of the hobos and the variety of travelers by the names that you talked about, what was the crime rate like when you had these encampments of hobos? There was a question earlier on asked about the crimes attributed to hobos.
Sure. That's another one of those ones that I don't know that there's great data on, unfortunately. It's a really interesting topic, though, because tramps and hobos certainly got into plenty of trouble, but they were also blamed for a ton of things that they definitely didn't do. If a farmer's barn burned down, it was those darn tramps smoking in the hayloft that I was so kind to let them sleep there the night before. Or if a boxcar was broken into, it's entirely possible that the merchandise was stolen by somebody that wasn't a tramp or a hobo, but they would have been blamed for it. So it's really hard to know what the crime rate was really like. As far as hobos in general, sometimes I think we probably over romanticize or maybe attribute more honor to hobos and tramps than maybe there would have been realistically back in the day. You talk about times where you could leave all of your belongings in camp and entrust that they'd be safely there when you came back. Hard to say how true that is. And obviously it would just be dependent on who was around at the time. But I wonder if the truth is somewhere between, totally honorable for hobos and kind of opportunistic tramps kind of a thing.
That could lead into some of the alleged signs where some are welcome and some are distrusted.
Sure.
Do you think that there was any way that the populace could get a signal about how do you trust a hobo versus how do you don't trust a hobo?
Not necessarily from the sort of the civilian point of view. I would assume a lot of it was I don't know, life was different then, right? So you wouldn't just look out your window and close the door in somebody's face like we probably would now. Not that everybody's that way or that everybody was kind back then, but it was definitely a different time. But yeah, as far as civilians having a sign or that kind of a thing, not necessarily the case for tramps and hobos, probably just more of a site by site, case by case, and how you felt in the moment.
You mentioned that these hobos and tramps were great storytellers. Some of yarns and some of half truths and some maybe straight up facts. Well, did any of these folks go into politics?
Oh, I'm sure if we went down the road, we could find a couple. I don't have the details right now. I know that there's a book on my shelf from, I believe it was a Canadian man who hoboed, who then became maybe a town mayor or something, but I don't have specifics right off the bat. But
that would be something interesting for another presentation later.
Sure, absolutely.
Research on that. Well, speaking about going and seeing these monikers and these signs, lots of people really wanted to know what's the best place to see some of these in the wild, so to speak.
Sure.
And is there any location that seems to have that you've traveled, that have a higher density of these monikers and signs painted on walls?
Yeah, so a couple points there. Let's see. I think if you're interested in the old stuff, the best recommendation I would have is just to go look at whatever's old and nearby you, honestly, and start there. There are definitely a few museums, if anybody wants to reach out, that have some collections of hobo monikers. I'm thinking of the Britt Hobo Museum, obviously, in Iowa, in Britt, Iowa. I forget the exact location, but it's called the Endeline Museum out that way as well. They've got an old dismantled shed with some hobo monikers.
Are you talking about Curie, Minnesota? Because I think I've been to that one.
It very likely could be.
Yeah, I've been there.
Right. That sounds right. If you're not necessarily interested in the old stuff, realistically, any spot where you can see freight trains, you'll see modern monikers. Most of them are honestly not necessarily left by people who ride the rails anymore. There's a good portion of those that are done by railroad workers or just people that like doing graffiti or are interested in railroad culture and history as well. And you can watch those go by on trains. You'll usually see them in black or white. It's essentially done with a markall, like an industrial oil pastel type thing. And you'll start to see repeats and people who mark more often than others and one-offs and unique things like that going by on the freight train still to this day. Just kind of the evolution of the older hobo monikers themselves.
Some people are starting to send in ideas. The Black Butte Center for Rail Cultural.
That's another great one.
Railroad culture. There is the End of Line is in Curie, Minnesota. And we have about 100 carvings in our collection. That's from Janet. So I don't know if Janet is from Minnesota. One of the things that people asked is, did hobos randomly ride the rails in any direction, or did they go with a purpose?
I would say usually there was a purpose, even if it was as simple as I'm bored here or uncomfortable here kind of a thing. A lot of times, once again, you would follow, if you were a working person, seasonal worker, you would follow the harvests, obviously, really up and down the West Coast and then along the high and low lines there, through the Dakotas, Montana, and all that. Really great places to find seasonal work with the crops and all of that. And then a lot of people would tend towards the West Coast during the winter, obviously stay warm, stay out of the snow and all that, especially if you're unhoused and kind of roughing it on the rails. That would be the place to be for the winter months for sure.
Then people were asking about, there was in the video, there was a little mention of this, the English-speaking hobos and the non-English speaking hobos. Do you have any sense of how many non-English Americans were traveling at the same time during the time periods that you researched?
Yeah, I wish I had more hard numbers to give off the top of my head. That's something I could provide a follow-up for, but I don't know right off the top of my head. But you definitely would have had a ton of sort of first-generation immigrants, non-English speakers, or English as a second language speakers out on the rails. It would have been a really fascinating group of people, not as English heavy and English speaking as we would see today.
Well, at the time that you were talking about and referencing during the teens into the 30s, there were a lot of immigrant waves coming into America. You know, the Irish, the Italians, the Spanish, and it would it'd be curious to see how these different ethnicities worked the rails.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely some smaller studies or smaller sample sizes of people who studied hobos, but I don't have those numbers right off the top of my head. But definitely interesting to see how they fit in there and how some of those groups really helped build the railroads over the years.
Right. And in the video, there was a whole bunch of language that I didn't understand, like what's a ding-a-ling?
So that can mean a ton of things, usually just kind of a inexperienced or not maybe a true hobo kind of a thing.
So that's the hobos being pejorative over somebody who is a wannabe.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for that. We're going to close our question session, go to the end of our program, and then we'll open the lines for everybody.
Sounds great.
So thanks for that, Charlie. That was fascinating. And I hope that people took note of your URL and your website, because you have a lot of good stuff for availability to answer some folks' questions.
I appreciate that.
If you liked this video, it will be coming up to our DCNRHS YouTube channel. And on that channel, you can find a lot of other wonderful programs that we put together over the last 2 years almost. And we invite you to look at any or all of them. Just thank you again for attending. And we will hope to see you at another session, the third Friday of the month. So thanks again, Charlie.
Thanks, Ann, and for everybody for organizing.
Thanks to our guests who are not DCNRH members. We welcome you. We welcome you to future events, and we look forward to your engagement with us. So we thank you very much. And once again, we welcome you all to our next presentation, and we thank you so much for joining us here tonight. Bye all.